Your hands start to sweat. You look at the ceiling of your room or at people walking down the street, and for one terrifying instant, the ground simply disappears. Everything feels artificial, like a staged set. Your immediate instinct is to panic and seek a quick distraction, because the physical sensation feels like you're losing your sanity. But quantum physics and modern neuroscience have uncovered something disturbing about that millisecond. Your brain isn't breaking. It is actually shutting down the most sophisticated security system in the universe. The real question is, what is your biology desperately trying to hide from you in that exact moment of collapse? Because that feeling, the one you try to escape, is not random. It's a crack in the system that has been filtering your reality your entire life. And for a brief second, something real slips through. Not dramatic, not mystical, just raw, unfiltered perception. And your system panics, not because something is wrong, but because something is finally different. If you stay for a moment longer instead of running, you begin to see what was always there, hidden behind noise, identity, and automatic reactions. You know that horrible feeling of being surrounded by longtime friends or family, and suddenly feeling a cold emptiness, as if you're speaking completely different languages. Your body is there, but your frequency no longer fits the room. This isn't depression. Your brain has a neural network called the default mode network, which acts as the limiting filter responsible for creating the constant voice in your head. When the illusion of reality begins to crack, studies show that this network loses energy and shuts down. The character you thought you were starts running out of battery. And that's the part no one prepares you for, because for most of your life, that voice in your head felt like you. It narrated your past, rehearsed your future, judged your choices, and gave everything a sense of continuity. It stitched together your identity so seamlessly that you never questioned it. It felt solid, reliable, permanent. But it was never the core of you. It was a process, a pattern, a loop. And now, for a brief moment, the loop stutters. When the default mode network begins to quiet down, something strange happens. The mental center you usually operate from starts to dissolve. Thoughts don't disappear completely, but they lose their authority. They stop sounding like commands and start sounding like noise. That's when the discomfort creeps in. Because without that familiar narrator, your brain struggles to locate who is in charge. There's a gap where your identity used to sit, and your system doesn't like gaps. It wants stability, predictability, something to hold on to. So it reacts. You may feel slightly detached from your surroundings, like you're watching instead of participating. Conversations sound distant, even if the voices are right next to you. Faces you've known for years seem oddly unfamiliar, as if you're seeing them without the usual emotional labels attached. It's subtle but deeply unsettling, and the immediate interpretation is almost always the same: something is wrong. But what's actually happening is far more precise. Your brain is reducing the activity of the system that filters reality into a story about me. That filter normally selects what matters, what doesn't, what's threatening, what's safe, and how everything relates back to your personal identity. Without it running at full strength, raw perception starts to leak through. Not in some mystical, dramatic way, in a quiet, almost clinical shift. The room feels flatter, time feels slightly distorted, the emotional charge behind things weakens. It's as if the world is still there, but the usual layer of meaning has been peeled back. And that's where the fear begins to build. Because meaning is what keeps you anchored. It tells you why things matter, why you should care, why you should react. When that layer softens, your system interprets it as a loss of control. But here's the important part most people miss. The brain doesn't distinguish between losing your sense of self and facing a real external threat. To your biology, both feel like danger. So even though nothing around you has changed, your internal alarm starts to prepare for impact. Not because something is attacking you, but because the structure that organizes your reality is momentarily unstable. It's like a pilot losing access to the instrument panel mid-flight. The plane is still flying, but without the usual data, the system assumes the worst. And this is where many people make a silent, automatic decision. They try to turn the system back on as fast as possible. They reach for distraction. They force thoughts. They cling to familiar roles, friend, parent, professional, anything that restores the sense of, I know who I am. And when the default mode network reactivates, the relief is immediate. The voice comes back online. The world regains its familiar shape. The discomfort fades. But something important was just interrupted. Because that brief shutdown wasn't a malfunction. It was a window, a short, rare moment where your brain loosened its grip on the identity it has been maintaining for years. A moment where perception wasn't fully filtered through the usual narrative, and instead of exploring it, your system slammed the door shut, not out of weakness but out of conditioning. You were never taught how to stay there, even for a few seconds longer. You were never shown that this glitch is actually a natural function of a flexible, adaptive brain. So the next time it happens, the reaction is even faster, the resistance stronger, the fear more immediate, and slowly, without realizing it, you train your system to avoid that state entirely. But the brain doesn't just shut something down without consequence. When that network drops, even briefly, it creates a sudden imbalance. Information starts flowing differently. Sensory input becomes less filtered. Internal signals become louder. And that's when the pressure begins to rise. Because without the familiar structure holding everything together, your biology starts asking a more urgent question. If the self is unstable, what exactly is keeping you safe right now? And that question doesn't stay philosophical for long. It moves fast, straight into your body, where another system is already preparing to respond. The moment this filter drops, your senses stop lying, the world loses its solidity, and pressure reaches a critical level. Your amygdala, your primitive survival center, cannot distinguish between your ego dissolving and a real predator trying to devour you in the wild. As a defense mechanism, your body floods with cortisol. It's a chemical storm of pure anxiety. Your animal biology is fighting with everything it has to force you back into focusing on matter. And it does this fast. Before you can even form a clear thought about what's happening, your body is already reacting. Your heart rate shifts. Your breathing becomes shallow or irregular. There's a tightness in your chest or a strange hollow feeling in your stomach. Your muscles subtly contract, preparing for movement. Even if you're sitting still, nothing in your environment has changed, but inside everything is signaling danger. This is where the confusion deepens, because part of you can see that there is no actual threat. You're in a familiar place. You're safe. No one is chasing you. Nothing is attacking you. But another part of your system doesn't care about logic. It's older than logic. The amygdala doesn't analyze, it reacts. It scans for patterns of instability, and when it detects that the structure of your identity is weakening, it treats that as a critical failure. From its perspective, if the self is not stable, then the entire system is exposed. So it escalates. It sends signals through your nervous system, telling your body to prepare for survival. Adrenaline mixes with cortisol. Your attention narrows. Your senses sharpen in a distorted way. Sounds may feel louder, light harsher, movement slightly off. At the same time, your mind starts searching for explanations. This is where thoughts begin to spiral. What is happening to me? Am I losing control? Is this permanent? These thoughts don't come from clarity. They come from the alarm itself. They are attempts to regain certainty in a moment where certainty has disappeared. And the more you engage with those thoughts, the more fuel you give to the system that is already overloaded. It becomes a loop. Your body feels unsafe, so your mind tries to fix it. Your mind generates fearful interpretations, which signal even more danger to your body. And the cycle tightens. What started as a subtle shift in perception now feels like a full internal crisis. This is why so many people misinterpret this moment as something breaking inside them. Because the intensity is real. The sensations are real. The fear is real. But the cause is misunderstood. Your system is not collapsing. It's overcompensating. It's trying to rebuild stability as quickly as possible, using the only tools it knows: tension, urgency, and control. And here's something even more important to notice. The alarm isn't trying to hurt you. It's trying to protect you using an outdated map. This part of your brain was designed in a world where losing your sense of orientation could mean death. If you didn't know who you were, where you stood, or how to respond, you wouldn't survive long in a wild environment. So when your identity begins to loosen, your biology reacts as if you've stepped into chaos without protection. It doesn't understand that this moment is internal. It doesn't understand that nothing external is threatening you. All it knows is that the familiar structure is gone, and that is enough to trigger full activation. But here's where things take a critical turn. Because while this chemical storm is rising, your system becomes extremely sensitive. Every reaction you have in this state gets amplified. If you resist the feeling, the resistance itself is read as more danger. If you try to force control, your body tightens even more. If you panic, the alarm confirms its own warning. Yes, this is a threat, and the intensity increases. But if, even for a brief moment, something different happens, if instead of fighting the sensations you pause, there's a subtle shift, not relief, not immediately, but a small interruption in the loop. And that interruption matters more than it seems, because beneath all this noise, something else is happening at the same time. The same moment that triggers the alarm is also the moment where your usual filters are down. Your perception is more direct, less shaped by habit, less controlled by automatic patterns, which means your response now has a different kind of impact. You're no longer just reacting inside a fixed system. You're influencing how that system reorganizes itself. And this is exactly where many people, without realizing it, make a decision that shapes what comes next. Because in the middle of this intensity, there's a strong impulse to escape at any cost. To shut it down, numb it, distract yourself, or grab onto anything that brings quick relief. It feels justified, necessary even. But the nervous system, already overloaded, is not built to handle impulsive corrections in this state. And one wrong move here doesn't just end the discomfort. It can leave a deeper imprint, one that lingers far beyond this moment and changes how your system responds the next time this threshold is crossed. It is exactly in the middle of this chemical crisis that thousands of people on the spiritual path make a devastating mistake. The nervous system is fragile, overloaded with this intense internal energy, and if you make the wrong decision here in an attempt to escape the discomfort, you can trigger years of apathy, depersonalization, and even serious emotional damage. There is a flaw in human behavior when facing the unknown. If you don't correct this quickly, your system locks up. I'm about to show you the exact way out so you don't fall into this failure. But first, you need to understand what the electricity of your mind is actually doing. Because what feels like chaos is not random. There is a pattern to it. When your usual sense of self weakens and the alarm system floods your body, your brain enters a highly unstable, but also highly plastic state. Signals fire faster, connections loosen, and your system becomes more impressionable than usual. It's like wet cement. Whatever you press into it in that moment leaves a mark. And this is where the silent error happens. Instead of staying with the raw experience, most people try to override it. They attempt to fix the feeling as quickly as possible. Some reach for distraction, scrolling, noise, conversations. Others try to force calm, repeating phrases, controlling their breath in a rigid way, or mentally arguing with what they feel. On the surface, it looks like self-control. But underneath, it's resistance. And resistance in this state has a very specific effect. It tells your nervous system that what's happening is dangerous and must be avoided at all costs. So the brain learns. It begins to associate this opening, this moment where the self loosens, with threat. Not because the moment itself is harmful, but because of how you reacted to it. And once that association is formed, your system adapts in a protective way. It starts shutting things down earlier next time. You become less sensitive, less open, less present. Not as a failure, but as a defense. This is where apathy can begin to take root. Not the kind that comes from laziness, but the kind that comes from a system that decided it's safer not to feel too much. In more intense cases, this turns into depersonalization, a persistent sense of being disconnected from yourself or the world, like you're watching your life from a distance. It's not that something broke, it's that your brain built a buffer, a filter designed to make sure you don't cross that threshold again. And here's the part that's hard to see while you're inside it. The original moment, the one that triggered all of this, was actually a doorway. A brief opening where your perception was less filtered, where your identity was more flexible, where something new could have been integrated. But instead of stepping into it slowly, your system panicked and tried to seal it off. Not because you did something wrong intentionally, because no one showed you how to remain there without forcing an outcome. The human instinct, when faced with intensity, is to move away from it, to solve it, to get back to normal as fast as possible. But this specific kind of experience doesn't respond well to force. It responds to precision. And precision in this context means something very simple but very counterintuitive. It means not interfering more than necessary. Right now, your mind is like an electrical grid under surge. Too much current, too many signals, too little stability. If you start flipping switches randomly, trying to control every sensation, you don't stabilize the system. You overload it further. What actually helps is reducing unnecessary input, letting some of that energy discharge naturally, allowing sensations to rise and fall without immediately labeling them as a problem. This doesn't mean doing nothing, it means doing less of what creates friction. Because every time you stop feeding the loop of fear and control, even for a few seconds, something subtle changes. The intensity doesn't spike as high, the waves don't last as long, and your system begins to register a new piece of information. This state, while uncomfortable, is not fatal. That realization doesn't come as a thought. It comes as a shift in your body, a slight drop in tension, a small return of breath, a moment where the urgency loosens its grip. And those moments matter more than any technique, because they start to rewrite the association your brain created earlier. Instead of linking this experience to danger, your system begins to link it to tolerance. And from there, something else becomes possible. But this is also where another mistake can quietly take shape, because as the intensity lowers and the immediate fear starts to fade, your mind begins searching for stability again. It wants something to hold on to, something familiar, something that brings back a sense of control, but in a more comfortable, less chaotic way. And this is where many people unknowingly trade one illusion for another. Not the old identity they had before, but a new one, cleaner, stronger, more elevated, and far more difficult to question. As your mind searches for an exit, your brain cuts off the cheap dopamine you used to get from external validation and living on autopilot. The world loses its flavor. This is a brutal withdrawal from matter. The tension becomes suffocating because your old life no longer fits, and the new one hasn't taken shape yet. Most people can't handle this void. They quit here and force their mind back to sleep. But if you have the courage to simply observe this discomfort without escaping, your brain activates a powerful relief mechanism. At first, it doesn't feel like relief at all. It feels like something is missing. The things that used to give you quick satisfaction, checking your phone, getting approval from others, staying busy just to avoid silence, start to feel flat. Not necessarily bad, just empty, like eating something that looks good but has no taste. And that absence is hard to sit with, because your system has been trained for years to rely on those small hits of stimulation to regulate itself. They kept your mood stable, your identity reinforced, your sense of direction intact. Now without them, everything feels uncertain. You might look at your daily routine and feel a strange distance from it. Conversations that once felt engaging now seem repetitive. Goals that used to motivate you lose their emotional charge. It's not that your life suddenly became meaningless. It's that the mechanism that used to assign meaning is recalibrating, and during that recalibration, there's a gap, a quiet, heavy space where nothing seems to fully land. This is the point where many people misinterpret what's happening. They think they've lost something essential, that their drive is gone, that their connection to life is fading. But what's actually happening is more precise than that. Your brain is reducing its dependence on external triggers to generate internal states. Instead of being constantly pulled outward toward approval, distraction, or stimulation, it's starting to shift inward, searching for a different kind of stability. And that transition is not smooth, because the old system was fast and predictable. You knew what to do to feel something. You knew where to go for a quick sense of relief or identity. This new space doesn't offer that. It asks you to remain present without immediate reward, to stay with a moment even when it doesn't entertain you, to feel without instantly reacting. And that can feel unbearable at times. The silence becomes louder than noise. The stillness feels heavier than activity. You may even catch yourself wanting problems back, just to feel something familiar again. That's how strong the conditioning is. But if you don't escape, if you resist the urge to fill the space too quickly, something subtle begins to happen beneath the surface. Your system starts to reorganize, not in a dramatic way, but in small, almost unnoticeable shifts. Your breathing deepens slightly. Your attention becomes less scattered. The pressure that once felt suffocating begins to spread out, losing its sharp edges. And in that space, a different kind of perception starts to emerge. It's quieter, less reactive. You begin to notice things without immediately labeling them as good or bad. A sound is just a sound. A thought is just a thought. A sensation rises and falls without demanding a response. This is where the relief mechanism begins to activate, not as a sudden wave, but as a gradual release of unnecessary tension. Because the brain is starting to realize something important. It doesn't need to keep producing urgency when there is no real threat. And that realization changes how energy moves through your system. Instead of being trapped in loops of stimulation and reaction, it begins to settle. You may feel moments of unexpected calm, even in the middle of uncertainty. Not because everything is resolved, but because the need to constantly resolve everything is fading. And that's new. But this stage carries a quiet risk, because as the discomfort decreases, your mind starts to look for ways to stabilize this new state. It wants to understand it, define it, and most importantly, claim it. You might begin to think, I've figured something out, or I'm not like before. There's a subtle shift from observing the experience to identifying with it, and it feels harmless at first, even rewarding. Because after moving through confusion and intensity, finding a sense of clarity feels like progress. But this is exactly where the next layer of illusion can form, not built on distraction or autopilot, but on a more refined sense of self, one that feels aware, elevated, and separate in a new way. And if you're not careful, that new identity can become just as limiting as the old one, only harder to detect. Quantum physics shows that matter changes state simply by being observed. Inside your brain, the same rule applies. When you stop fighting and simply observe your chaotic mind, the old neural pathways of fear and trauma lose their energy supply. The physical relief is indescribable. Brain scans show stress waves slowing down dramatically. Anxiety collapses from lack of attention, like a plant that withers when it's no longer watered. But this doesn't happen the way most people expect. Observing is not the same as trying to calm yourself down. It's not repeating something in your head or forcing your body to relax. In fact, the moment you try to control what you feel, you're no longer observing. You're interfering. And the system can tell the difference. Real observation is quieter than that. It has no agenda. It doesn't rush to fix, label, or escape. It simply allows what is already happening to be seen clearly, without adding extra tension on top of it. At first, this feels unnatural, because your mind is used to doing something with everything it experiences. If a thought appears, it analyzes it. If a sensation arises, it reacts to it. If discomfort shows up, it tries to remove it. So when you stop engaging in that Privitchny pattern, there's a brief moment of disorientation. You're still aware of the anxiety. You still feel the tightness, the pressure, the unease. But something subtle has changed. You're no longer inside the reaction. You're noticing it. That small shift, almost invisible, is where the entire process begins to turn. Because fear, at its core, needs participation. It feeds on a tension that is tangled with resistance. It grows when you argue with it, when you try to outrun it, when you treat it as something that must be solved immediately. But when attention becomes still, clean, and direct, the dynamic changes. The sensation is still there, but it's no longer being amplified. It's like watching a fire without adding more wood to it. The flames may continue for a while, but they stop growing. Inside your brain, this has a very real effect. The circuits that were firing intensely, linking sensation, thought, and alarm, begin to lose synchronization. Without constant reinforcement, the signal weakens. The body receives fewer danger messages, and slowly, it starts to stand down. You might notice your breath deepen without trying, your shoulders drop slightly. The sharp edge of panic softens into something more manageable, not gone but no longer overwhelming. And with that softening, something else becomes visible. You start to see that the thoughts themselves were never the true problem. They were echoes, reflections of a system trying to protect you. When you observe them without getting pulled in, they lose their authority. They pass through. One moment, there's a thought saying, something is wrong. The next moment, it's gone, replaced by something else. And for the first time, you're not chasing it. You're just noticing the movement. This is where a different kind of stability begins to form. Not the rigid stability of control, where everything has to be managed and kept in place, but a flexible stability, one that allows movement without collapsing. You begin to trust that sensations can rise and fall without destroying you, that thoughts can appear without needing to be believed. That discomfort can exist without requiring immediate action, and that trust is not built through ideas. It's built through direct experience, repeated in small, quiet moments like this. But there's something important to stay aware of here, because as this relief sets in and the intensity of fear drains away, your mind will try to interpret what just happened. It will want to take ownership of the shift. It might say, I did this. I figured it out. I know how to stay in control now. And that's where a new layer begins to form, a more subtle one, because now instead of being trapped in fear, you risk becoming attached to the one who observes, the one who remains calm, the one who understands. It feels like progress, and in many ways it is. But if that identity hardens, it quietly recreates the same structure you just stepped out of. A center, a role, a new version of me. And this one is harder to question because it feels right. It feels elevated. It feels true. But beneath that sense of clarity, the same mechanism is waiting, ready to rebuild itself in a more refined form. And this is where that devastating mistake I warned you about usually strikes. To escape the void too quickly, your brain creates the spiritual ego. You begin to feel special, adopting a blind sense of superiority, judging everyone who is still trapped in the matrix. Your suffering decreases, but you haven't truly awakened. Your brain has simply created a more sophisticated and prideful illusion to regain control. If you fall into this trap, the veil closes again. But it doesn't feel like a trap. It feels like clarity. After everything you just went through, the confusion, the fear, the emptiness, this new state feels clean, stable, almost elevated. You're no longer reacting the same way. You can observe your thoughts. You feel less affected by things that used to bother you. And that shift is real. The problem is not the calm. The problem is what your mind builds around it. Very quickly, a new narrative begins to form. It's subtle at first. A quiet sense that you now see something others don't, that you've stepped outside the usual patterns while everyone else is still caught inside them. You may not say it out loud, but internally a separation starts to grow. There's you, and then there's everyone else. You begin to interpret ordinary behaviors through this new lens. People chasing validation, reacting emotionally, getting lost in distractions. It all becomes obvious to you, almost predictable, and without noticing, observation turns into judgment. Not harsh, not aggressive, but constant. You feel more centered than before, but also slightly disconnected, not in a painful way like before, but in a quiet, almost comfortable distance, as if you're watching life from a higher position. And that's exactly how the illusion stabilizes. Because now your brain has rebuilt a sense of identity, but this time it's reinforced by insight. It's no longer I am anxious or I am lost. It becomes I am aware, I am different, I understand. And those statements feel true. That's what makes this stage so convincing. But if you look closely, the structure is the same as before. There is still a center being maintained, still a position being protected, still a version of you that needs to exist in a certain way. The difference is that now it's harder to question. Before, your identity was tied to obvious patterns, your past, your roles, your reactions. Now it's tied to something that feels deeper, more meaningful. So when it forms, you don't resist it. You embrace it. And slowly, the openness you experienced begins to narrow again. Not completely, not all at once, but enough. Enough to bring back a subtle tension, because maintaining this new identity also requires energy. You have to keep seeing yourself as the observer. You have to keep reinforcing the idea that you're operating at a different level. And anytime something challenges that, an emotional reaction, a moment of confusion, a return of old patterns, it creates friction. You might feel disappointed in yourself, or try to quickly correct it, or ignore it altogether, but underneath, the same mechanism is running again. Control, just in a more refined form. And here's the deeper issue. This spiritual identity doesn't just separate you from others, it separates you from reality itself. Because instead of directly experiencing what is happening, you're now filtering it through the idea of being the one who is aware of it. It's a small shift, but it changes everything. You're no longer just present. You're present as someone. And that someone becomes the new lens. This is why the illusion becomes so difficult to detect at this stage. It's transparent. It doesn't feel heavy or restrictive. It feels clear, even liberating. But it quietly blocks something essential, because as long as there is a need to be the one who sees, there is still a boundary in place, a subtle division between you and everything else, and that division keeps the system intact. So even though your suffering has decreased, the deeper shift hasn't fully happened yet. You've moved from chaos to control, but not beyond it. And if you stay here too long, this identity becomes rigid. You stop questioning it. You build your life around it. And the same patterns you thought you left behind begin to reappear in different forms. Comparison, validation, attachment, just wearing new language. But if you catch it early, something else becomes possible. If you notice that even this sense of being aware is something your mind is holding on to, a different kind of seeing begins to open. One where you don't need to be anything at all, not reactive, not elevated, not even awake. And in that space, something much more unsettling and much more honest starts to reveal itself. If you avoid this trap, the fog fully clears, and everything you were taught loses meaning. Old science claimed the brain created consciousness, like a machine generating energy. But modern physics suggests the opposite. Your brain never created who you are. It is actually a restrictive antenna, a dense filter designed to block the vast quantum field so you could focus on survival. You don't gain mystical powers when you awaken, you simply turn off the factory limiter. And that realization doesn't arrive as an idea, it lands as a direct shift in how you experience yourself. For most of your life, it felt like you were located somewhere inside your head, behind your eyes, thinking, deciding, controlling. The world was out there, separate, something you had to navigate and respond to. That division felt unquestionable, but when the filter relaxes enough, that structure stops holding. You begin to notice something strange. Thoughts are still appearing, but they don't feel owned in the same way. They arise, move, and disappear on their own. Sensations happen, perceptions unfold, but there is no clear center managing it all. The sense of being a fixed point starts to dissolve, not in a dramatic or mystical explosion, but in a quiet, almost obvious way. It becomes harder to find the edge where you end and everything else begins, and this is where things can feel unsettling again, because without that clear boundary, your system doesn't know where to anchor identity. There's no solid place to stand, no fixed role to return to. But if you don't rush to rebuild that structure, something deeper reveals itself. You begin to see that what you are is not a thing, not a body, not a thought, not a personality. Those are all happening, but they are not what you are. They are expressions moving through a field of awareness that has no clear center and no fixed limits. And that awareness is not something your brain produces, it's something your brain tunes into, like a radio receiving a signal. The signal is always there, but the device determines how much of it gets through. For survival, your brain narrows that signal, filtering out most of what doesn't immediately serve function, safety, or identity. That's what created the sense of separation. Not because separation is absolute, but because it was useful. It allowed you to focus, to act, to build a life within a complex environment. But now, as that filter loosens, the signal widens, and with it, your perception changes. You might look at something simple, a tree, a wall, another person, and feel a subtle shift. Not just seeing it as an object out there, but sensing it as part of the same continuous field of existence, not as a belief, as a direct impression. And your body responds to that. The tension that came from constantly defending a separate identity begins to soften. The need to control every outcome weakens. Even the sense of time can feel different. Less like something chasing you, more like something unfolding. But this is not a permanent state you achieve. It's a perspective that becomes available when the filter is no longer dominating everything, and your brain is still part of the process. It hasn't disappeared, it's adapting. Because even as this broader awareness becomes clearer, your system still needs to function in the physical world. You still need to speak, decide, move, respond. So a new balance begins to form, not the old rigid identity, and not complete dissolution, but something more fluid. Your brain starts integrating this expanded perception into its normal operations. Neural pathways begin to reorganize. Patterns that were built around fear, control, and constant self-reference lose priority, and new patterns begin to take shape. More efficient, less reactive, more aligned with what is actually happening, rather than what your mind assumes is happening. This is where science and experience begin to overlap in a very real way, because this shift is not just philosophical, it's neurological. Your brain is literally changing how it processes reality. And as this integration deepens, something else begins to activate. Not as a sudden event, but as a gradual synchronization. Different regions of your brain, which used to operate more separately, logic here, intuition there, start to communicate more fluidly. The division inside your own system begins to dissolve, just like the division you perceived outside. And with that, a new level of clarity starts to emerge, one that doesn't rely on effort, one that doesn't come from forcing understanding, but from the system finally operating with less internal conflict and less distortion. Without the limiter blocking the signal, the neurological shift completes itself. Your entire brain lights up, and both hemispheres synchronize, producing high-amplitude gamma waves, the peak of human processing. Logic and intuition merge. From that moment on, when you look at a tree or a stranger, your biology understands at a cellular level that you are made of the exact same vibrating atomic structure. Separation dissolves, but this doesn't feel like gaining something new. It feels like interference has finally been removed. For a long time, your brain was working in fragments, different regions handling different tasks, often out of sync. One part analyzing, another reacting, another remembering, another predicting. And in between all of that, small delays, distortions, and conflicts shaped how you experienced reality. Now, that fragmentation begins to settle. Signals move more cleanly. There is less internal noise competing for attention, and because of that, perception becomes sharper, not in a dramatic or overwhelming way, but in a precise and quiet clarity. You see things as they are, without immediately translating them into personal meaning. A sound is just a sound before it becomes annoying or pleasant. A face is just a face before it becomes someone I like or someone I don't trust. There's a brief moment where reality is experienced directly, without being filtered through layers of memory and expectation. And in that moment, something fundamental changes. Your reactions slow down, not because you're trying to control them, but because there is less distortion triggering them in the first place. It's like your system no longer needs to defend a fixed position. There's nothing rigid to protect. And this is where the synchronization in your brain becomes noticeable in a very practical way. Decisions feel different. Before, they were often driven by conflict, logic pulling one way, emotion pulling another. You would analyze, hesitate, second guess, trying to find certainty. Now there's less friction. Information still moves through both pathways, rational and intuitive, but they are no longer competing. They inform each other. You understand something and feel it at the same time. And that creates a kind of efficiency that doesn't feel forced. You act with less hesitation, Not because you're rushing, but because the internal resistance is gone. At the same time, your body reflects this shift. There's less chronic tension. Your breathing becomes more natural. Even your posture can change slightly, as if your system no longer needs to brace itself against the world. Because at a deeper level, it recognizes that what it once treated as other is not separate in the way it assumed. And this recognition is not philosophical, it's biological. Your nervous system begins to register your environment differently. What used to trigger subtle stress responses, unknown faces, unpredictable situations, small uncertainties, no longer carry the same weight. There's still awareness, still discernment, but without the constant undercurrent of threat. And that frees up energy. Energy that was previously used to maintain identity, defend boundaries, and manage internal conflict is now available for something else. Attention becomes more stable. Presence becomes less effortful. Even complex situations feel more manageable because your system is no longer overloaded by unnecessary signals. But there's something important to understand here. This state is not about escaping difficulty. Challenges still exist. Emotions still arise. Unexpected situations still happen. The difference is in how they move through you. Instead of getting stuck, they pass. Instead of triggering long chains of reaction, they resolve more quickly. It's like your system has become more conductive, able to process experience without holding on to it, and that changes how you relate to reality itself. The world no longer feels like something you have to constantly manage or defend against. It becomes something you interact with more fluidly, more directly, almost like a field you're moving within rather than a set of obstacles you're trying to control. And with that shift, a new question naturally begins to form. If your perception is no longer locked into the old patterns, if your brain is now operating with less distortion and more coherence, then what exactly shapes the reality you experience from this point forward? Because once the noise is reduced and the system is synchronized, even small inputs begin to have a stronger effect. And that means something very subtle but very powerful is now in your hands. This is not philosophy. It's deep neuroplasticity grounded in physics. From the ashes of your old identity, your brain builds entirely new neural pathways. You gain a clear awareness that the wall in your room is 99.99% empty space, yet you still use it as protection from the wind. The difference is this: the external world is no longer a threat. It becomes an electromagnetic playground, and that shift changes how your brain allocates its resources. Before, most of your mental energy was used to predict danger, maintain identity, and react to uncertainty. Even when nothing was wrong, your system stayed busy scanning, comparing, preparing. Now that energy is freed, and the brain doesn't just leave that space empty, it repurposes it. New patterns begin to form, not based on fear or habit, but on direct interaction with what is actually happening. This is where neuroplasticity becomes something you can feel, not just understand, because your attention starts to shape your experience in real time, not in a magical sense, but in a very concrete way. What you consistently notice, your brain strengthens. What you stop feeding, your brain weakens. It's a simple mechanism, but now it's operating without as much interference. So if your attention moves toward tension, your system can amplify it. If your attention rests on clarity, your system stabilizes around it. And for the first time, you can see this process as it happens. You might notice how quickly a small thought can change your entire state, or how a moment of stillness can reorganize your body without effort. The connection between perception and physiology becomes obvious. And with that awareness, something shifts in how you engage with the world. You stop treating your experience as something fixed. Instead, you begin to see it as something dynamic, something that is constantly being shaped by where and how you place your attention. This doesn't mean you control everything, but it does mean you are no longer passive. You are participating, even in simple moments. Walking through a familiar place can feel different, not because the place changed, but because you're no longer filtering it through old assumptions. Details stand out more, space feels more open, interactions feel less scripted. You're not just moving through reality, you're interacting with it in a more direct way. And this is where responsibility quietly enters the picture, not as pressure, but as clarity. Because once you see how your internal state influences your perception, it becomes harder to ignore your role in the process. You begin to notice when you're slipping back into automatic reactions, when old patterns try to reassert themselves. And they will. The brain doesn't erase years of conditioning overnight. Certain triggers still exist, certain habits still try to run, certain emotional responses still appear. But now, they don't have the same authority. They show up, but they don't define the entire experience. And that gives you space. Space to respond differently. Not by forcing change, but by not reinforcing what no longer serves you. This is how the new reality is engineered. Not through big, dramatic shifts, but through small, consistent adjustments in attention and response. Each time you notice a pattern without feeding it, it weakens. Each time you remain present, instead of reacting automatically, a new pathway strengthens. And over time, those small changes accumulate. Your baseline shifts. What once felt normal, stress, urgency, constant thinking, starts to feel unnecessary, and what once felt difficult, stillness, clarity, patience, becomes more natural. But there's an important detail here. Even as this new structure forms, the world itself doesn't become perfect. Uncertainty remains. Other people still act unpredictably. Situations still challenge you. The difference is that your system is no longer organized around resisting those things. It adapts instead. It moves with what is happening, rather than constantly pushing against it. And because of that, your experience becomes less about survival and more about interaction. Almost like learning how to navigate a space that was always there, but that you couldn't fully access before. And the more you explore this, the clearer it becomes that this playground is not something separate from you. It responds to how you show up, not instantly, not always in obvious ways, but consistently enough that you begin to trust the process. And that trust allows you to engage more fully, to take action when needed, to remain still when nothing needs to be done, to move between both without conflict. But this is where a deeper level of mastery starts to emerge, because understanding that reality is flexible is one thing. Living inside that understanding, while still functioning in everyday life, is something else entirely. The true mastery of this process is not escaping to the mountains. It's walking through your neighborhood, paying bills, laughing with people, while deeply understanding how the source code works. Heavy emotions and daily challenges will still come, but now they pass through you like wind through an open room, without breaking anything. You stop being a victim of the simulation and quietly sit in the architect's seat, and from the outside, nothing about your life may look different. You still wake up, answer messages, deal with responsibilities, make decisions, face delays, misunderstandings, and unexpected problems. The surface remains familiar, but internally, the structure has changed. There is no longer a constant need to defend an identity in every situation. When something goes wrong, the reaction still appears, but it doesn't take over the entire system. It rises, moves, and fades without turning into a story about who you are. That's a subtle shift, but it changes everything. Before, a small frustration could spiral into hours of tension. A single comment from someone could stay in your mind all day, looping, growing, attaching itself to your sense of self. Now those same moments happen, but they don't stick the same way. You notice them, you feel them, but they don't define the rest of your experience. It's not detachment in the sense of not caring. It's clarity without entanglement. You can fully engage with life, have conversations, feel emotions, take action, without being internally pulled apart by every fluctuation. And this is where real stability shows up. Not as something rigid, but as something flexible. You're no longer trying to control every outcome or predict every possibility. You respond to what's in front of you with more precision, because your perception is less distorted by past patterns and future fears. You see situations more directly. And because of that, your actions become simpler, not always easier, but clearer. There's less overthinking, less hesitation caused by internal conflict. When something needs to be done, you do it. When nothing needs to be done, you don't create unnecessary movement. That alone removes a huge amount of friction from daily life. But there's something deeper happening at the same time. You begin to notice how other people are still operating inside the patterns you once had. The tension, the reactivity, the constant search for validation or control. It becomes visible. And this can go in two directions. You can use that awareness to separate yourself, to feel different, to reinforce a quiet sense of superiority. Or you can recognize it as something shared, something human, because you've seen how those patterns work from the inside. And that recognition changes how you relate to others. There's more patience, less need to prove a point, less urgency to correct or fix people. You listen more, not because you're trying to be good or calm, but because there's less noise inside you competing for attention. And that creates a different kind of connection, not based on roles or expectations, but on presence. At the same time, you become more precise with your energy. You start to notice what drains you and what aligns with you, not as rigid rules, but as direct feedback from your system. Some environments feel heavy, others feel clear. Some conversations pull you into old patterns, others allow you to remain grounded. And instead of forcing yourself to adapt to everything, you begin to move with more awareness. You choose where to engage more carefully, not out of avoidance, but out of understanding, because you know that where you place yourself and your attention shapes your experience. This is what it means to sit in the architect's seat, not controlling every detail of reality, but understanding the principles that shape it, and working with them instead of against them. You're no longer trying to escape the system. You're operating within it, with a different level of clarity. And that clarity doesn't make you immune to difficulty. There will still be moments where old reactions come back, where emotions feel intense, where uncertainty returns. But now, those moments don't erase everything else. They are just part of the movement. They pass through. And each time they do, your system reinforces a new understanding, not as an idea, but as a lived experience, that nothing you feel is permanent, that no state defines you completely, that the structure you once thought was fixed is in fact flexible. And from that place, something very simple but very powerful becomes possible. You can live your life fully without constantly trying to protect yourself from it. You can participate without being consumed. You can care without losing balance. And you can move through the same world as before while seeing it in a completely different way. Breaking the illusion was never about rejecting the human experience. It was about stepping onto this ground with your eyes fully open for the first time. Your biological body, which spent decades as a prison of automatic reactions, has completed its upgrade. It is now a broadband receiver of the universal field. You can no longer unsee what you've seen. And now that you truly understand the mechanics behind the curtain, the universe is no longer something that just happens to you. You have become the universe happening, and from here, life doesn't need to be perfect to be clear. You'll still face noise, emotion, and uncertainty, but now you know how to see without getting lost. That changes everything in a quiet, stable way. If you made it this far, write this in the comments. I see without running. And if this connected with you, watch one of the videos on your screen. It will help you go deeper into this state and make it part of your everyday life.